All right. First of all, I'd like to ask us to all stand up and repeat a few things after me just to liven things up a little bit. Please, if you would oblige. Thank you very much. All right. So I would like you to repeat after me. So I'll say something and you say right back. Whether the weather be hot, or whether the weather be cold, we'll be there for each other whether we like it or not. Thank you very much. Please be seated. All right. First of all, before I begin, I'd like to take a second, I feel compelled to deconstruct what my colleague said about the African collective losing its identity. I'd like to say it has not lost its identity. I'd like to say its challenges and its struggles are contextual and geopolitical, and in time, we will deal with these challenges like everybody else is. All right? Moving on, I'd like to first begin by stating correctly that culture is very important. Okay, now I've had the privilege of collecting anecdotal data from people from different cultures, right? Of course, through focus studies. And one of the things I've come to realize is that when people talk about their cultures, they do so in very selective or very discrete contexts or terms. They talk about the music, the dance, folk tales, and so on and so forth. And when they do so, their eyes light up. They do so with gusto and with energy. And I realize that a lot of people, when they talk about the cultures, do not talk about peace as an identity, as a cultural identity. And as a communication scholar, I identify that as a communication problem. I believe that until cultures posit peace as the forefront of their cultural identity, cultural diplomacy would be difficult to implement. Every culture, transcending race or ethnicity or nation or religion, must first and foremost posit peace as the most salient identity before we can even have cultural diplomacy. So yesterday when Mark talked, he asked the question, how can cultural diplomacy aid terrorism? How can cultural diplomacy aid global governance? And the young man from Nigeria asked the question, can culture and peace go hand in coexist? The answer is yes, it can coexist, and in areas where it does not coexist, it is up to us to make them coexist. Because if they don't coexist, we cannot even begin to have the talk about cultural diplomacy. So, what happens when a community has faced or seen the worst of humankind? What happens after extremists have gone into a village and raped and kidnapped and arrested and trained people to carry out further atrocities? What happens to the people who have survived such experiences or people who have witnessed such carnage? What happens to them? Usually, we expect them to transcend these experiences. We expect them to heal, to reconcile. But how? What are we doing to expand the people's capacity to forgive, to transcend, to even attempt to coexist? What are we doing? I think it is established by now that peace is the answer. It is established by now that cultural diplomacy is the answer. But the real question is, how do you do that? How do you get people to see themselves as capable of transcending their horrid experiences? That is where the challenge is. And I don't have the answers, of course. I do have a few suggestions, however. And I'm going to be doing so by proposing or talking about northern Nigeria, where the Boko Haram insurgency has been rampant, and what steps have been taken towards reconciliation and how that ties into cultural diplomacy. All right? So how do we expand people's capacity to heal, to reconcile, to transcend their experiences, to forgive and to coexist? Of course, we do so by positing peace as the most salient cultural identity, an effort that requires strategic communication campaigns like cultural diplomacy. Now, this perspective emerged from my research on the rhetoric of Boko Haram. Now, I sought to understand, to provide communication analysis of the agitation propaganda of the Boko Haram sect. Now, of course, such study is vital to the understanding and shaping appropriate counter-communication measures to the threat of violent extremism. While the Boko Haram uprising has been studied from diverse academic perspectives, after an excellent literature review, I found a scarcity of research on the rhetoric of Boko Haram. And as a communication scholar, I recognize that violent extremist groups place a great deal of emphasis on developing comprehensive communicative strategies in order to reach the desired goals. their ability to develop and implement such sophisticated strategies show their fanatic conviction and professionalism. So I explored several artifacts of Boko Haram's communication. I contacted journalists, government officials to gather every communication that they have had with alleged spokespersons of Boko Haram, emails sent directly from representatives of Boko Haram, and so on and so forth. And I use this with the framework of victimal ritual to provide some analysis. So in order to describe, analyze, and understand the persuasive devices by which Boko Haram leaders create, express, and sustain jurisprudence on acts of violence, I relied on the guiding research question: what are the core values of Boko Haram, and how do leaders of the group construct and express these values, sway belief, and justify violence? The rationale for my study was clear. If terrorism is fundamentally rhetorical, then it must be essential to deconstruct Boko Haram's message to understand its persuasive appeals. Now, I studied under Robert Ivy, Professor Emeritus of Rhetoric at Indiana University, and he alleged that if we can talk ourselves into war, then it stands to reason that we can talk ourselves into peace. And that was critical to me. If we can talk ourselves to war, we can talk ourselves to peace. How do we talk ourselves to peace? It's really the essence of my talk here today. So in the next couple of minutes, I will share some of my findings and suggestions for countering the appeals of violent extremism in devastated communities, and reaffirm the need to expand people's capacity to heal, to reconcile, to transcend experiences, to forgive, and to coexist. But first, a few strategies. So first of all, one of the things Boko Haram does very well is that they're able to construct the values. Now, redeeming non-Muslims from perdition, liberation of Muslims from persecution, protecting Islam from criticism, and avenging perceived acts of injustice against Muslims are the values that have emerged from the whole communication. So these are the values they believe they're fighting for. The way they frame Islamic fundamentalism, turning to cyberspace, often aids those classified as terrorists to speak for themselves, to express their needs, stances, and objectives, as opposed to letting conventional media represent their causes. In the face of perceived misrepresentation, Boko Haram leaders turn to the internet to clarify the insurgency. Leaders of Boko Haram present the group as not as a societal ill, but as societal liberators. How does the group attempt to normalize violence in Islam? Leaders of Boko Haram present the group as victims who are merely resisting persecution, and which is an antithesis strategy that promotes social solidarity among a victimized group and baits sympathy from neutral observers. How does the group provoke the need for Islamization? Boko Haram's mission has emerged from a perceived anti-Islamic agenda by the enemy other, which would be the Nigerian government, perceived Western ideals, and democracy. Internally, Boko Haram's message posits the Nigerian government as antagonistic towards Islam, and this serves to create the preconditions necessary for militant recruitment and jihad. How does the group vilify the enemy other? Boko Haram resorts to the vilification of Christians, democracy, and Western ideals in order to foster its rhetorical mission, which is to coerce Muslims into Islam, liberate Muslims, defend Islam from persecution and criticism, and revenge perceived acts of injustice against Islam. To a large degree, what we observe through the internet are efforts to convey the culture of resistance, which terrorist groups believe adequately characterizes their mission and conduct. And finally, how does the group sustain a holy war? The alleged war between Boko Haram, the Nigerian state, Christianity, democracy, and Western ideals is born out of the action, interaction, and reaction of the entities involved. In the process, the group constructs Islamic sainthood by assuring members, moderate Muslims, and would-be recruits of spiritual ends, if only by glorifying the sacrifice of one's life for Allah. Now, claiming to be carrying out the will of Allah to defend Muslims and the religion of Islam, Boko Haram has allotted blame, vilified the enemy other, pressed for a holy war, encouraged martyrdom, and allotted blame, and alluded to the apocalypse. While these rhetorical frames remain culturally and geopolitically situated, the bold semblance to the rhetorical frames utilized by other extremist groups in the Islamic Maghreb, East Africa, the Arabic Peninsula, and the Middle East. Now, much has been expressed about the magnitude of destruction and desolation by Boko Haram, including the context in which religious violence has emerged in northern Nigeria. Now, upon these findings, what has to be done for the communities in northern Nigeria to move forward towards reconciliation? Now, stout solutions have been presented on the tables of national security. Raise the school attendance in northern Nigeria, create jobs through agriculture and exports, offer amnesty to militants who are willing to surrender, or take massive military action. Granted, these steps in strategic combination could be successful. However, beyond these steps lie the approach of orchestrated communication strategies that posit peace education and processes as the dominant identity in these communities. All right? Peace identity through peace education builds restraint, moderation, and discretion among victims, observers and witnesses to the brutality and carnage created by Boko Haram and other violent extremists. Now, one thing is certain, acts of terror, of course, create cynicism, hatred, fear, distrust in the hearts and minds of witnesses and survivors. But how can they reconcile? How can they transcend? Cultural diplomacy must begin with peace education as a means to creating peace as a cultural identity, which, and when peace is salient, of course, when peace is a salient cultural identity of every cultural community, then peace building and peacekeeping can take place, can be sustainable. If we place peace education on the same pedestal as reading and math education, then we're moving towards reconciliation. One of the speakers yesterday talked about going into Afghanistan and trying to rebuild the communities, and he talked about emphasis on math and English and literacy and things like that. Those things are great, but until we place the same emphasis on peace education, until peace is held on the same pedestal as STEM education or STEAM education, if you include the arts, then we're not even ready for cultural diplomacy. We must institute, from preschool to college, peace education on the same pedestal as math and as literacy, so that cultures, irrespective of tradition, of nationalism, of race, of ethnicity, or gender, can all unite under that cultural identity, which is peace. That is the beginning of cultural diplomacy. Over and over again, past encounters show that horrific manipulations of religion or nationalism or any other ism are clearly best countered first and foremost by an alternative ideology that invites people to pursue unity, peace, and progress rather than terror. That alternative theology is perhaps an ICD-ratified peace curriculum. If mandated, emphasized, and promoted from preschool onwards, peace education can begin a culture in which we come to see ourselves first and foremost as peace entities before we see ourselves as black or white or Muslim or Christian. At the core of most world religions are teachings of love, peace, and kindness. Thus, communication campaigns, including strategically framed talking points, must shape interfaith dialogues, public messages, old and new media publicity, community forums, and education campaigns must redirect the frames back to these fundamental human values. Furthermore, visibility is essential to the communication campaign. The strategic communication vitriolic strategy should increase the visibility of nonviolent actors in every significant cultural machine. The voices of moderation, the voices of peace and civility, and the voices of reason must receive more media focus than they currently get. Peace education curriculums across the globe would help shift the thinking of those who might otherwise consider violence. These efforts have begun in northern Nigeria. Some Islamic schools in northern Nigeria are now teaching a new state-sanctioned curriculum based on peace and tolerance in an effort to dilute the influence of Boko Haram. Through the statewide peace-building initiative, Muslim scholars have produced a peace-based curriculum to fight the Boko Haram influence at schools, to teach young Muslims about peace, reconciliation, and forgiveness. This is not to say that the religion is not inherently peaceful or the claims that that peace does not exist in the religion. This is a different kind of peace education that does not only that is not only inherent in the claim, but actually considers processes and methodologies. Aliyu Muhammad, 24, age 24, told Al Jazeera News, "My Imam teaches us that peace is the way to live. If there is no peace, we won't survive." This is a young student beginning to understand or see himself first as a peace activist before he's a Muslim, before he's black, before he's a Nigerian. And that's the way forward. Teaching peace as a cultural identity that transcends religion or creed expands people's capacity to heal, to reconcile, to transcend experiences, to forgive, and to coexist. It is our strongest tool to building a more peaceful and safer world. Teaching about the dynamics of peace and peace processes and forging new identities is how we can create a universal culture of peace. If we cannot cultivate a culture of peace, we have no future. Thank you.